This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
No, strategic is good.
That's what I thought. I thought so. Anyway, all right, we're starting. So, are we ready to go?
Yeah.
Okay, everybody. Thank you for being here. I'd like to welcome the first of the guest speakers that we're going to have in the next couple of sessions, taking us up to the end of the semester. It's Jane Homewood. I'm privileged to have Jane as one of the PhD candidates that I co-supervise, and she's doing amazing, wonderful work in her PhD. She's also, as you'll see on the screen behind, she's the Executive Director of Statutory Planning Services for DELP. And Jane's going to talk to us, as you can see again, about population. She's going to talk about the role that her PhD work has played in her current work, and I guess by extrapolation what examination into theory and into history can do to inform your day-to-day operations as a planner, and many other things besides. She'll be available for questions at the end. That's true, isn't it, Jane?
Yep.
So thank you very much again for coming, Jane, and I'll just leave it with you.
All right. Hi. I'm also very privileged to have David as one of my supervisors. I'm not used to doing lectures, so excuse me for my foibles, but what I thought I'd do is I'll give a quick overview of Victoria's growth, give you a sense of my PhD, and the real interest in my PhD is are there lessons from the 1960s and 70s that we can bring forward and help us plan for Melbourne's predicted doubling in growth. So, Melbourne took about 180 years to grow to 4.5 million, and it's now predicted that Victoria will grow to 10.1 million by 2050. So if you look at that from a time point of view, that rate of growth is unprecedented, and as we know, we hold up Victoria's and Melbourne's livability as one of our great badges of honour, and I think it's going to be a great challenge to maintain the quality of life and the livability that we experience, and we're already seeing that in spatial inequities as Melbourne grows. How can we, and what are the processes we can, and you, because I'm getting to more at the end of my career, but what are you going to do to maintain that livability as we double in size? As David said, I'm very happy to take questions. I'll give you a very quick overview of my role. So I'm an Executive Director in DELP, which is Environment, Land, Water and Planning. So it's a very large department. Planning exists with my group, which we do approval for the Minister of planning permits over 25,000 square metres in the City of Melbourne in the capital city zone and some other areas across Victoria like Geelong. We make changes to the planning scheme, so if a local government wants to approve changes to their planning scheme, put in a neighbourhood residential zone or a design and development plan or a structure plan. And we also do the approval process through the EES process of major projects, so Westgate Tunnel, Metro, North East Link. And my current occupation, my kind of priority is Fisherman's Bend, which is the largest urban renewal program. And as many of you will know, that the capital city zone was introduced without a development contributions plan or a master plan to identify where the open space would be, where the transport routes would be, and so this minister, one of his election commitments was to put in a new urban structure and also have planned growth that could be supported by infrastructure. Right, okay. Okay, so that gave you a quick overview. So since 2016, population growth has remained a really hot topic for both Houses of Parliament and for the community, and all of you that have been living in Melbourne over the last 5 years will recognise we're really starting to feel with congestion the impact of that unprecedented growth. So Victoria's growing faster than it ever has, and we increased in population in 2015-16 by 146,000 people. I'm sure there are some mathematicians in the audience, but I think that's about 300 people a week or a day, someone call out, and 144,000 in 2016 and 17. So it just took under 10 years for the population to increase from 5 to 6 million. And by June 2018, we're expected to be at a population of 6.5 million. So we are the fastest growing state in Australia, and of course that was New South Wales until recently, so we're growing at 2.3% per annum at the moment. That growth is made up of, I'll get the arrows right, so 88,000 from overseas migration, nearly 17,000 for interstate migration, and a natural increase of 42,000. So there were 81,900 births and 3,900 deaths. You can see by the next slide that the majority of that growth has been in Greater Melbourne. And so this is a map of Victoria, and you can see that that 4.725 million is 76.5% of our population is in Greater Melbourne. And the next slide shows you that 86% of recent growth has been where it's been located, and you can see that that's in the last 10 years nearly 1 million people just in the growth area. In the wider metropolitan area. This slide gives you an idea about where the population change is occurring. So I don't know if you're aware, but the government's commitment at the moment is for 100,000 new lots to be approved this calendar year. So those new lots are in the greenfield areas. So recently the government introduced an expansion of the urban growth boundary, and that's to accommodate those new suburbs, so Melton, Whittlesea, out in the southeast corridor, Casey and Cardinia. And a real challenge for this government is to work out, well, how do we make sure that with that growth we are actually providing the required schools, road network, public transport to actually accommodate that growth. And also there's been unprecedented growth in the inner city. So the recent statistical analysis that we've done is, for quite a while people thought with the planning controls that are much stricter in the inner Melbourne area, so Stonington, Bayside, Boroondara, City of Yarra, there was a kind of view that those suburbs weren't doing the heavy lifting of accommodating growth, but the recent statistical analysis has shown that, and I suggest many of you drive along the main roads of Stonington around these South Yarra Station. You can see those enormous towers that wedge between the river, Chapel Street and the railway line. If you drive around Boroondara, you can just see overall there's just this constant redevelopment of what was, quite large single dwellings. Now often you're going to get in 3 or 4 story apartments. So those inner and middle suburbs are taking a lot more growth than was initially thought. I'll try and get these arrows right. So the highest density is in the inner city. So those, you can see through the chart that that's over 7,000 people per square kilometre. It's good to see the next slide, which gives you an idea about how that compares to other parts of the world. And I'll briefly talk about Fisherman's Bend at the moment, because if Fisherman's Bend continued to grow as the permits that were approved up under the initial controls, or what the Minister did, he introduced GC50, which was like a modified, a more restrained area of growth. If that occurred all over Fisherman's Bend, then we would have had population densities like Hong Kong, and now we're looking more around the kind of, what would I say, like a Barcelona model. So still quite dense, but not to the density that's outlined in Hong Kong. Still getting it wrong. So the policy changes that have enabled increased density, there's a good example here in Bentley, so that the older developments were 1 or 2 stories, single dwellings on a block, and with the new changes with the residential growth zone, we're seeing more and more higher density development along the railway lines and the main roads in these inner and middle suburbs. So this gives you an overview of that projection of 10.1 million people by 2051, with 8 million in the Greater Melbourne area and 2.1 million in the region. So you'll see in recent policy debate there's been a real focus on increasing growth in the major regional cities, Geelong, Bendigo and Ballarat, and significant investment by government to try and start to get better transport in those areas. And we can also see that there's, understandably, I think it makes kind of good sense that in those areas like Castlemaine or areas around Bendigo and Ballarat and Geelong, Torquay for example, you can see people making lifestyle choices. Do I want to live out in the outer suburbs in Melton, or actually do I want to live in a smaller community like Ballarat or Bendigo, or get all the kind of great value of living in somewhere like Castlemaine and then commute into one of the regional cities? And those councils who are also experience the impact of growth are trying to work out, well, we're valued, if you think of Castlemaine, we're valued because of our quaint, low-density rural lifestyle. How much growth should we accommodate? And a lot of the residents, so we get, I can quote you, I write 4,500 letters a year from the residents across Victoria. A lot of the communities in those groups are saying we want our children and our families to be able to co-locate in these areas, and government policy has been restricting growth in those areas because it wants to maintain the valued character. So you can really see that the planning scheme is going to need to radically change to be able to address this significant area of growth. And I'll just briefly give you an example. So my group also approves wind farms, solar farms, and you can tell as we move from coal and we move to a more renewable energy focus, the planning scheme hasn't been adjusted to say, well, how do we balance a solar farm in an agricultural area like Shepparton, where we've invested an enormous amount of money for irrigation for crops, and we're now finding that solar wants to actually locate in those areas, and we've still got some work to do at a state level to make sure that the state planning policy keeps up with actually managing that growth. This gives you an idea about the future growth projected across Melbourne and the surrounds. So you can see that some of those areas right out in the west are starting to, in fact, reduce in population, and that would make sense with much larger scale farming, but also the impacts of climate change as we get away from the areas that have good access to water. At a recent meeting in the Loddon Mallee region, the local people, so that goes up to up the north of the map, it's kind of that area where you can see the huge area of reduced population. Water is their #1 priority, so we're starting to feel the impacts of climate change. When you look into the inner city, which is that inset area, You can see, you know, really significant growth to the west, but also just intensification across the whole of the metropolitan area. This will just give you an idea, and of course you'll have access to these slides, about the total number of dwellings constructed, and you will probably be aware that as we've moved from a manufacturing economy, we are moving to an economy that is increasingly reliant on the construction industry. So you can imagine that the Treasurer loves that. Saul Eslake, who is an economist that used to be at ANZ, recently wrote in The Age that growth for growth's sake is a real challenge for sustainability. So how are we growing, and what does the job profile look if we remove construction? How's our medical, education, advanced manufacturing jobs going? And he was of the view that we need to be spending a lot more focus on how to grow jobs in industry and business beyond construction. And one of the things that the government has done to address that, because I think that's the biggest challenge, we're one of the largest metropolitan areas, and access to jobs near your home is one of the most important things for social cohesion. If you're spending 2 hours in a car between jobs, that's not great for family and extended family, and also so that you build community to have jobs locally. So the new plan Melbourne does two things. It introduces the policy around the 20-minute city and the 20-minute neighbourhood so that you can meet the majority of your local needs locally, and then the new national NEX, employment and innovative clusters that are located in Monash, so where you've got hospitals, universities and good access to transport. You've got Monash, Latrobe, Parkville, of course, and the metro line has been incredibly important in providing really good access to Parkville. And I've missed one. So Dandenong. And so I had Monash, Latrobe, Parkville and Werribee. So Werribee was an old farm that's now being developed with a new hospital, the expansion of the Mercy. Melbourne University's got its expanding vet school out there again, another important cluster to service people in the west. Have I gone? I keep going the wrong way. This just gives you an idea about where growth has occurred, so where construction has occurred. So a bit of trailing off in the last few years in the inner city, and we're clearly getting councils like Boroondara asking to bring in blanket heritage overlays across the municipality because the pressure of growth and the value of land is so great that whether it's the City of Yarra asking us to introduce controls along their strip shopping centres, so Johnson Street, you know, that's quite a challenge because it from kind of Elgin, as you go down, you get into the City of Yarra from Nicholson, but the character changes so much all the way down the river. Swan Street, so enormous pressure in that Swan Street Cremorne precinct, where you've got a lot of old heritage buildings, and there's now increasing pressure for them to be redeveloped for residential development. We're currently doing a project specifically in response to Cremorne and the pressure for growth around innovation. So Cremorne has one of the largest clusters of innovative businesses, and if you allow large developments, they move, as you know, gentrification moves those innovative businesses. So what is the role, if any, of government to try and manage through planning maintaining innovative clusters? So West Melbourne is another area with lots of new startups. What should government do to try and maintain that diversity of uses and activities? Because at the moment, residential seems to be trumping most things. And then here you can see approvals. So the top line gives you the total approvals, total residential approvals. And then from the bottom, the green is the semi-detached row or terrace houses and townhouses. the flats and apartments in the red, and detached houses, which would really be reflected in that significant growth in those new urban growth areas. And I discussed before the 100,000 lots. Reflecting a lot of, I'm assuming a lot of you live in the inner city, that the majority of young people are still living within that 10-kilometre radius. And then this just gives you an overview of the principles in Plan Melbourne, which I assume you're all pretty familiar with. So the lessons from the PhD. So my work looks at the radical change that took place in Melbourne between the 60s, 70s and 80s. So I hope you're all familiar with the Urban Choreography book that's just been printed, which looks at the 80s onwards, and Kim Dovey, Rob Adams and Ron Jones were the editors of that book. So that looks at that part of City of Melbourne and how it got its livability reputation. My interest was, recognising the great work of Rob Adams. How did we get there? I'm sure there was a lot more than, it's never just a person, even though people are incredibly important. It's also the people that surrounded those people and the events that led up to that appetite for significant change. So the 60s and 70s were a time of incredible reform, and similarly from what's happening to Melbourne now, it was a time where there was enormous population growth comparatively to what had been happening previously. And in response to that growth, there were models, and you would have heard of Jane Jacobs, of building high-rise towers, demolishing slums and putting in freeways. So it was a kind of car-based planning solution to manage growth. And in response to that, there were a number of activists which I kind of categorised into 4 groups. So a big focus of my work has been Morrie and Ruth Crowe, who were radical communists who really changed the way a number of bureaucrats, planners, students thought about the city. So they informed people. I think no one can underestimate their energy and their compassion and diligence in setting an image for a different Melbourne than was being proposed by the MMBW and the major transport group. It was also a time which is very different, in my view, to the way the church was operating. So the church was operating in the inner city from a social reform background. So they were working very closely with community of trying to provide not only to engage with the people living in those lower income areas, but also providing them with support and actually standing up for their rights. There were what was called the trendies, and Melbourne University, its academics and students were absolutely there, going out, finding out who was living in the inner city, working with them and working very hard to protect the inner city from being demolished. And it was a time when new heritage controls were brought in. So it's kind of hard to think in the 70s and 80s there weren't heritage controls. And then the other thing, which was through ignorance, I had no idea how Gough Whitlam, who was the first Labor Prime Minister for a number of years, was so influential in positioning the Cain Labor government and preparing the Cain Labor government for getting into government. So Whitlam came, after he was dismissed in Canberra, he came down to Melbourne and he completely reformed the ALP of getting rid of all the factions and actually getting a lot of people, a lot of students, a lot of architects, a lot of planners involved in the Labor Party. And there was a Labor Resource Centre set up where they actually wrote all the policies that they were going to take into government. And there were people we know now like Stuart Morris, a famous planning QC, Evan Walker, McCutcheon, architects, the academics involved in writing those new policies. So McCutcheon, Howe, and I've gone blank. People will tell me. David, help me. The very famous black African.
Martin Luther King.
Thank you, Martin Luther King. It's all right. This was all the time, as I was saying, of radical change, and so there was the death and life of great American cities. It was a time when La Mama was located, which was a radical theatre group. You can see the proposed plans for the existing Collingwood area, and these proposals were for all across Carlton, Fitzroy, Collingwood and Richmond, to demolish all the terrace houses and replace them with these high-rise towers. Ruth Crowe and her husband Maury were unusually communists, and so it really intrigued me that they would have such an enormous influence on the creation of new policies that actually established Melbourne, because in the 60s there were sayings like Reds under the beds, you know, communists wouldn't have any access to bureaucrats and be able to influence policy. But they did, and there was a town and country planning association that they used to meet in the Myer Foundation. It was full of all the kind of highest paid company representatives, significant conservative architecture faculties, and over this period they were replaced with people like Evan Walker and Brian McCutcheon, who and Maury Crowe, who started to write new policies for the government. It's interesting to look, I think, at this slide. So in the late 60s, Maury Crowe was instrumental in the Trade Unions Living Standards Convention. And if you look at the seminar statement, it was really interesting because at this time they were, unlike, say, the Save Our Suburbs people that we have today, they actually supported intensification. They supported growth, but they wanted it to be done in a managed way. They were, and I think this is the real challenge for Melbourne and Victoria as we move into the next period of growth. They were deeply committed to fostering public discussion on planning problems. So they saw it as a community-wide problem, not a problem that should just be dealt with by bureaucrats. They called on federal, state and local government to have integrated long-term plans that the community had input through, and that they wanted those plans to be based on thorough research and through development, thorough research and surveys. Central to their objectives were human values, and they also wanted to ensure that growth, areas of growth and the population was supported by adequate cultural and recreational facilities, and that the work and the design enhanced human dignity. So at the time that they were working, if you went into the city of Melbourne, it operated from 9 to 5, virtually no one lived in the city, and all the beautiful cultural resources and activities were really closed and only open during those business hours. So they really wanted to open up those facilities to the wider community. They also wanted the coordination of public authorities, so to make sure that it was integrated development. Public transport should be better and cheaper, that they wanted to ensure that growth patterns minimise commuting, but also ensured that people had access to open space. They wanted to ensure that the valued areas of which now are the green wedges were conserved, and they wanted to ensure that there was experimental housing. So some of the Crowe's work looked at the Bauhaus work and the early Deutsche Werkbund area, and this was a particular interest of Ruth Crowe because she wanted to have her children looked at. So those Deutsche Werkbund models looked at more communal living. So you might have a small kitchen in your house, but you'd still come together to have more communal cooking and activities to support a more equitable ability for people to engage in a wider life than just having a traditional role as looking after your kids and preparing all the meals. This just gives you an idea, because there was a recent demonstration from the trade unions in Melbourne last week, but I think that central photo gives you an idea about the number of people that were coming out demonstrating about land rights for Aboriginals, against the Vietnam War, equal rights for women. So it was again, a really radical time of change. One of the fundamental documents introduced by Evan Walker and David Yenkin, who ended up being the head of this faculty, was the Central Melbourne Framework for the Future. I think someone quoted the current planning scheme has 8,000 pages, and this document is about 40 pages in length. And what it did is it set down the really critical urban structure elements of the city that needed to be reinforced and protected. So you can see on that map with the physical framework, this was the beginning of making sure that our rivers and waterways were clean and they became part of the natural environment, of the city environment. So the city used to turn its back on the river, and it was through Evan Walker and David Yenkin that South Bank was developed, and that was about us turning ourselves back to the river. You can see by the lines reinforcing the boulevards so that they became not only important in terms of the legibility of the city, but they also linked part of the cities that hadn't been reinforced before. So you can see the important links to the bay, and we can see how over the last 20 years the bay has grown so significantly around Port Melbourne. The other important thing was protecting the heritage structure within the inner city. And there are a lot of debates and arguments about saving Collins Street, which was being slowly demolished in the area. How do you get people to get their heads around how the city needs to reconsider itself, or how do we get citizens to rethink about a city at this growth? So a really important part of that was closing Swanston Street, because there was a lot of debate about whether Swanston Street should be closed or not, and it would kill the city and traders would never survive. So David Yenkin put turf down and opened it up to the city, but it was kind of a radical thing to make people rethink. The other stroke of genius that I don't think anyone planned, when the City of Melbourne, so the City of Melbourne had been sacked, when Kane came in, they got re-elected, and there were a number of, Lecky Ord, who was the first female Lord Mayor, was an architect, Winsome McCackey, Trevor Huggard, who was an engineer, but a very strong advocate for heritage architecture. You had this new group of councillors, and in their Melbourne plan, so there'd been a number of plans that had been rejected by the community, they made a commitment to provide housing within the inner city, and they set a population target of 8,000 people, and you'll hear Rob Adams say they kind of thought that would be okay. But what they did is they went in and the council renovated heritage buildings. And I don't think they understood how critical that was. So if you think of the city grid along all the back lanes, by renovating heritage buildings and redeveloping them for apartments, they were all strata titled. So you've got 20 or 30 or 80 owners, so they're really difficult to redevelop. And the slow incremental growth of those apartments has really been the saving of that lower density heritage laneways that we love so much now. So I'm going to whip through the next slides because I do want time for you to ask any questions. So I was recently in Tokyo at a workshop on different ways of managing growth, and I think the challenge for Melbourne is that, of course, we've got cities in Asia that are growing at much greater rates than we are, but the European cities that we often say, I want to be, like Barcelona or Amsterdam, have much, much smaller growth rates than we're experiencing. However, I think that this is just a great, for me, this was a really interesting way that Amsterdam engaged with its citizens to engage them and talk about growth. So the first thing they did is they took over their state library, and they asked a number of their citizens how to make yourself better, how to make the world better, and how to stimulate the appearance of projects. Because we know with growth, there's a lot of uncomfortableness by many communities, particularly that are existing in areas that they don't like what growth is looking like. So they invited artists and the avant-garde to do a whole lot of designs and ideas about what may a city look like and how may we contemplate growth. They did a number of models of their city and different projects for different areas and how they might interact with the city form. They undertook and had demonstration projects about, particularly in Amsterdam, as you'd understand with climate change, how are we going to manage the city from an environmentally sustainable point of view, and how are we going to manage climate change and sea level rises. They modelled the city and they identified where growth would be, and they put some limits around growth. They had this extensive project where they involved all school students and to come and partake and give their ideas and comments on what was important to you as a 5-year-old, 8-year-old, teenager, someone newly working. What did they want their city to be? They held an enormous number of debates, and they made sure that they were representative of a cross-section of the community, and they had a big involvement of innovative business people and artists. They went out on site, and the project in the background is where they've allowed a community member to build their own home with the support of artists and planners that worked in the government. So that was it.
I'm sure people will have questions, but I have a question before, and I'm allowed to
Ask
jump in.
first.
I'm allowed. One of the things that really interests me, and of course, as you know, I'm really interested in the Crows, and I'm so the and I love what you've done on the Crows so far, and I think it's great and fascinating. They're really extraordinary people. One of the things that you mentioned that they were communists, and that you were interested in how a couple of communists at a time, particularly operating, when communism was really demonised in Australia, for most of the time that they were active, that it was so extraordinary that they were nevertheless extremely influential, and they were winning awards in the early 70s for their work in planning, which was done more or less unofficially, but which did go on to produce some amazing documents that were really important. Do you think that, in a sense, I think that a lot of what they were doing was, I think from our point of view, common sense. A lot of what they were proposing was common sense, in some ways efficiency kind of things, very community-minded, very community-oriented. Do you think that the ideology kind of gets in the way, like thinking of them as communists is kind of, that remarkable aspect of them, which by the way, a lot of people ignore these days when they talk about the Crows, but it was clearly, it was totally there. It was there 24 hours a day, that's what they were.
Yeah. I actually think it's really valuable to understand they were communists, because if you were brought up in the 60s and you'd been through the Second World War, there was this demonisation. So what was it in the community, and I think you're right, that despite them being communists, they had incredible influence on people that are now, like the Minister of Planning, Richard Wynne, attended their meetings. If you look at the list of people that their newsletter went out to, it was the 101 of who was in government on both sides. So, and many of those people going on to be the Lord Mayor, like Lecky Ord, or who else? Winsome McCackey, but I was also trying to think of state government people, David. A number of state government people, McCutcheon, Walker. They were highly influenced, and if you look at their newsletters, the thing about them is they're completely bipartisan.
Yes.
They go across the best examples of communist Europe, but more importantly, the US, the UK, Scotland, which was really looking at some kind of very deep community involvement. And I think why they were so influential is because, and I think it's really interesting to now, is people were so sick of being told by people at the top what was going to happen to them and their local area. And I think it goes interestingly to something that's quite deep in Australian mentality about land ownership, and yet people's houses were being taken and demolished. And there were plans made where just wholesale, if you think about where you live, they're just going to demolish all your houses. So I think they were incredibly strategic in knowing that there were absolute values that were human values, no matter what your religion or your politics were, that was about human dignity. And if you think about what's going on, I think at the moment about the banks, the Bank Royal Commission, I just wonder, what is the community going to do about that? And are we going to get the kind of demonstrations on the street that we got? And if you talk to people that were involved in that time, they say, no, never again, that was a unique time. But if I look at my local neighbourhood, I can see that people might actually just withdraw themselves from the need to be so reliant on government. So solar off the grid. We've just had a big area, despite, I live near the Alphington station, so despite there being an incubator centre where the group of people running the incubator said, no, we don't want the farmers market. No, well, actually the communities just kept digging away, and now the farmers market's there every weekend, and the people running the farmers market are going to move into the incubator, and a whole industry and business is setting up. So I just think it's interesting, how will people react to growth and the role of government, because we've got a big job convincing people that government's worthy of listening to, because you can hear that people are saying we don't like this rates of growth. My EA lives in Melton, and they are putting screens down on all their houses because of what, and you think, God, what's happening to our livability? So how will the communities react to that?
What do you mean screens?
So those shutters?
Oh, those metal blind kind of things, right?
Yeah, I can't imagine living in a house with metal shutters.
Yeah.
Am I just a kind of, spoilt inner city? But apparently the whole street's putting them in. That's starting to tell you, that's telling me, gee, we've got some work to do with those communities.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't want to go on about the Crows, except I find them endlessly fascinating. But, I mean, as you know, Ruth and Maury lived their lives in a kind of, they were a model. They tried to be a model for everyone else. So they lived in a kind of, they lived very much in the community and of the community. They were always, they lived a kind of public domestic life, if such a thing is possible. And they made sure that everything that they did was as much as possible outside in the, they used the library, they used the swimming pool, they go on trips around the city and so on with their kids. So they were having a very, I don't know what you'd call it.
Public life.
A very public life, very public private life. It was, and they lived in a one room apartment and stuff like that. Do you think, so as a couple who, or as a family that obviously were trying to be a model, do you feel that they were trying to change the whole of society by what they were doing in Melbourne? Is that your? And do you think, you know, is there a capacity to do that kind of thing?
You might be able to answer that better than me, but yes, they had plans for the state.
Yeah.
They had plans for the city, and they'd all their writing. They say it's for human beings, human dignity, and they wanted a different way of living because in the 1960s, not many women worked, and a lot of women had worked during the war, and then once the war finished, they couldn't work anymore, and. You know, clearly Ruth wanted that freedom. She didn't want to be constrained by... Now, I think we're hopefully in a very different world now, but I'm just kind of moving into the future as well. The challenges we have about a public life and public safety, again, you know, indicate to me there needs to be a very different, radical way that we're going to engage with the community to, in fact, have a safe and livable community, if it is possible, because, as I said, the people that were working in that time are saying it's gone. We'll never, ever be able to revisit the kind of livability and freedom that we had then. It's a different world. We've moved on.
Yeah, that's an interesting challenge. Anyway, I fixate on that, on the Crow element of what you talked about, but you covered so much great stuff there. I'm sure somebody has, a few people here have questions. There's one at the back.
Yeah, just on the community engagement thing, where do you sort of stand on the Applewood Fed Square?
So I need to be careful because my group approves Fed Square. And Fed Square, currently there's a group of people that are working together, including City of Melbourne, the Office of the Victorian Government Architect. Personally, so not from a work point of view, personally I trained as an architect. I don't think architecture by community input is a good thing. I have respect for the artistic skills and talent of an architect. So I think that this engagement has been really valuable, and I think we heard very well that the community didn't want something that they thought looked like a Kentucky Fried Chicken. I do give huge respect to Donald Bates, who was the original architect, and initially Federation Square did propose a borders, so there's always been the idea of commercial development. I think that Federation Square probably needs a new master plan. What I find, so I don't know if you know Victoria Street East, but I was involved in the redevelopment of Victoria Street East, where you've got IKEA, and I was working at the City of Yarra, and there was a PDP process where that land was rezoned along the Yarra. And at the time, I worked for the City of Yarra, there was a Green Council, so Greg Barber, some of you may know, ALP and an independent. So it was really the emerging of the Greens coming into inner Melbourne. And we got absolute agreement by all parties that this was a good outcome. Now I've become involved with that project again, working for the Minister of Planning, and time has moved on and we actually need to revisit those kind of plans. So plans have, I think, a limited time frame. Federation Square is about to have a new station box for Metro, and also there's predicted that, and we'll wait and see, 2 million people will come to the Apple store on Federation Square. That's going to be a very different place to it is now. So in terms of the design process, I think the community heard, I think the government heard what the community said. So there's been 3 workshops that then formally the new design gets submitted to us. We then need to refer it to Transport for Victoria, VicTrack and the City of Melbourne, and I think the City of Melbourne has a good process of raising any concerns, and the Minister listens to those concerns. So, have you got other ideas about how you think it should have worked?
Well, I suppose there's sort of the design element which you sort of touched on, but also a public space effectively becoming a private space. And a lot of it's sort of happened in London.
Yeah.
Then you sort of get these quasi-public spaces where nobody sort of knows the rules, there's no transparency or accountability, and then that affects people's rights to those spaces as well.
So I know in Fisherman's Bend that's a real priority for the City of Port Phillip, because they have the majority of the Fisherman's Bend area, is they want their community facilities to be standalone, because if they're integrated into buildings, it becomes grey of what's public, what's private, and you start to get security guards. And, you know, I know out at Werribee there's a library in the shopping centre, but there's a guard there. So, you know, if you're not acceptable because of the way you look, or then I agree with you. Again, my personal view is I think that the opening up of the Yarra that will happen with Fisherman's Bend and the increased open space is a really good thing. But I think it's going to completely change with Metro and with the Apple store there. I know that my staff were hoping that it would be located on City Square, because, you know, they were concerned about the publicness. But Federation Square management is now saying they're struggling to get numbers to spend money. So, you know, hopefully with Apple there it might support greater food and beverage than's there at the moment.
Is that the point of it, though, to make money?
Not for Apple to make money, but you do need to have a spend to enable the, you know, I don't think government's going to start providing subsidies to restaurants and cafes. So I would hope that you've got activities to support as many restaurants and cafes as possible. And at the moment, the management's saying they're struggling, so.
Rebecca.
Can I ask two questions, and they're both about the crows, actually?
Yeah.
So first off, like, why did anybody sort of start paying attention to them, if you get my meaning? If they're just sort of two regular people, what is it that gave them that influence in the first place? Why did people start following their newsletter?
Yeah, because one thing is, I think Maurie, through that Labor Party conference, people were starting to get a feel, and it was happening worldwide, that the way growth was being planned in cities was not right. So there was an undercurrent, and there's a guy called John Howie who was head of Labor lawyers, and he said that when Whitlam got in as a Labor lawyer, he never thought he would get a substantial job in Australia. That everything was run depending on, you know, being of the elite lawyers. So I don't think you can underestimate the cultural change that was being brought on by a lot of radicalised students that were being listened to, and they hadn't felt that they could be listened to unless you were quite conservative and right wing.
But I mean, it's more about, like, I suppose, so he already had a public profile.
No. So I would say it's because they were so energetic, and they had this newsletter, and more people were saying, "This is fantastic. This is a different future." And they were very well connected. So David Yenkin and Maurie worked together. So in the Town and Country Planning Association, it was quite a conservative group.
Yep.
And then with Evan Walker, McCutcheon, Yenkin, they were rewriting policy. So they were very well connected to academics.
Okay.
And Melbourne Uni academics were very involved in rewriting policies. So they were very well connected to established people.
Yep.
But I don't think you can underestimate the feeling that we can actually change this.
Yeah, I think all of what you said is right, Jane. Can I?
Yeah, of course.
Say? I think that exactly what Jane said. They were connected. They were articulate. They could be real nuisances when they wanted to be. They just kept going. They were just tenacious, and they wouldn't stop. So they inserted themselves in. They were so active. They'd go out. I wouldn't say they'd go out every night, but they were so just present at so many different events and meetings. And if you go and look in the Crow archive, there's just there's so many bits and pieces of seminars and things that they went to, and that Maurie's or Ruth's notes in the margin, particularly Maurie, because he was. I think Maurie was at least at first more into capital P planning, in the 60s, and Ruth got on board with a sort of an aspect of that, the community aspect in particular, later on. But they were tenacious, and so
Yeah,
the right
in
time.
terminology, they built a brand for themselves.
Well, in a
Quite
manner of
successful.
speaking, I guess that's a way of looking at it. They were,
They were
certainly-
everywhere.
Yeah.
They were just everywhere. No matter what was discussed, they were there. And there was a real interest of having a discussion about Melbourne's growth. So they were right in there at every seminar, at every meeting, and they also worked. So the North and West Melbourne Residents Association, I mean, they rewrote a plan for City of Melbourne. They did that, the two of them, you know.
Yeah.
So I don't know. They're a bit like our secretary. The current secretary I've got, I don't think he ever sleeps. I don't think they ever slept.
No.
But that's related to my second question, which is, did they have jobs? Where did their money come from? I'm trying to sort of, I think these would be some of the questions.
Yeah.
that
No,
students would
you're
ask
quite
these
correct.
days.
I mean, it's like this is kind of, you know, I didn't articulate it all that well, but this is kind of the thing I'm thinking of. Like, how are they models, and how is their work a model for their time and for the present and so on, and their own approach, which I think is fascinating. Maury was a clerk for a union. He
Yeah.
worked for one of the, I can't remember what union.
Unions, yeah.
So he had a day job.
Yeah,
They lived very frugally.
okay.
So they weren't, and you know, they were, I think they lived on a shoestring.
Okay.
So, but on his wage, and Ruth worked for childcare a lot
Yeah.
of the time.
Yeah,
Yeah,
in Brunswick.
Okay.
Yeah.
yeah. Anyway, so we're still jumping around. Does anyone else have any questions for Jane on? That doesn't have to be about the crows. That's one little element of this whole thing, but.
Good, it's all over to you to manage Victoria's growth and maintain our livability.
Okay.
Good.
All right. You've satisfied everybody. That's
Thank
great.
you.
Oh, one more question. Where are the pro outlines?
VUT.
Okay.
Yeah, you just have to make an appointment, but it's well worth visiting. It's great.
Thanks. Good luck
Okay.
in your course.
Thank you so much, Jane.
My pleasure.
I think we might break for 5 minutes and then we'll reconvene and do the second part of the lecture. If that's all right with everyone? Cool. Thanks, David.
So,
Okay, no worries. Thanks. Okay, we might get started. Okay, so that was an interesting talk, and I want to pick up on the comments. Sorry, what was your name at the back?
Nick.
Nick asked, what is the point of this? Such a great question, in the sense of that conflict they're having at Federation Square around the, clearly Federation Square needs to be viable from an economic perspective. I think that's what she was trying to say. And Nick responded, well, is that the point? Who agrees with, so that is a good question. I mean, you can't really go against me and say it's not a good question now, but so who wants to add to that? Add to that. That was excellent. Well done. Yep.
It's a good question. Historically in Melbourne, we haven't done very successful public spaces.
That's
so
right.
The city of Heading, the
Yeah.
city square,
Yeah.
through its 2-3 permutations, was never really successful as Fed Square. So,
Mm-hmm.
maybe it's just like something about the fabric of Melbourne.
Maybe,
Square.
but still, what's the point? So is the point to provide really good, viable public spaces, or is it to make an economic return? Well, what do you think? Yep.
So Fed Square was designed to have businesses in it to attract people and make it a lively place. So if those businesses fail, then those businesses themselves, rather than the square, need to be economically viable, I think is the point
Sure.
she's trying to make. So if the businesses fail, if the square's not working.
There's a conflict. You're right, but there's still a conflict. It's not to suggest that the business is there, is viable, but maybe the point more is we need to make the square more from a viable from a public perspective. But that may not be putting it in a significant economic business zone. Is that the solution, or is that the only solution?
That's a solution.
You're right. I think that's the point. I think it's that is a solution. And when we're moving forward and thinking about contemporary debates or how we want our solution or how we want our cities to look, I think we need to be considering these conflicts and tensions, and there's not always one solution. There's a variety of different scenarios, but how do we decide on the scenarios? And I think there's another question that was asked around participation as well. And so what role does the public have in saying what the city looks like in the future? So Jane did touch on that when she drew upon the example, I can't remember what it was in Amsterdam? Was it Amsterdam? Yeah, in Amsterdam. But it would have been good more to hear about that. Well, what was the role of the public within that? But how did they become involved in decision making as well? Because that points to where we are moving, and this is something else that Jane touched upon as well, is that what's the role of government when we've got exponential growth? Well, I would say there's a pretty significant role for government. But what she's alluding to there is we're moving into what we're moving away from just government to governance. Do you know what the difference is? What's governance? So governance is what we incorporate in the public and the private spheres. So who is responsible for growth? What is the role of government within the different decision makings around Federation Square? So what we're starting to see, and what we'll see in today's presentation as well, in our contemporary debates, there's more blurring within the role of government within this sphere of public and private. Because prior to, I suppose, neoliberalism in the 60s, 70s and all around there, government had a really strong role. And it's really clear in decision making who were making the decisions. But now we've moved to governance. So within governance, we've got the blending of the public and private. And of course, you're going to have conflict. And the private is there to make a profit. Fair enough. But the government there is to represent the interests of the public. So you do have a conflict. So how do we start to resolve that conflict? But also, how do we make decision-making transparent as well within when we're moving into stronger governance roles? So, also, I tried to pick up a few more. I think that's all the notes. Okay, so contemporary debates. So, of course, we've covered the emphasis of the last two series of the lectures we're at week 11, of course, is around contemporary debates. But of course we have touched on contemporary debates throughout the course already. So I'm just going to recap where we have, in particular, like explicitly, and then I'm going to build upon that today. So if you remember back to week 1, I'm sure you all can, we talked there, we're talking about ideas and how ideas inform theory as well. But we very much talked about what new urbanology, and that's essentially, as we'll see again today, is around heightened neoliberalism, and that's where we are at. Within that, we concluded that the concept of sustainability has been mainstream. So when we're talking about a concept that, when we're talking about mainstream, we're talking about the emphasis. You think about economic, social, environment. Mainstream means the emphasis is on the economy. So very much is within business as usual. It's the status quo. So we've made now, as you'll see in today's lecture, we've mainstreamed sustainability. Sustainability essentially is greenwash, and it's essentially business as usual. But the emphasis is generally on economic sustainability. And we have touched very briefly on urban resilience, but we touched on urban resilience, I think it was week 4, from the perspective of our role of critical social sciences. But today I will frame it within, from the perspective of contemporary debates. Of course, we looked at equity and democracy, and as we saw today from the questions, are going to be very much more, hopefully, a part of contemporary debates. Indigenous planning as well, we saw from Professor Porter a very interesting lecture around Indigenous planning, and particularly what does that mean for city planning as well. So the structure of today's presentation, I probably won't get through it all. I didn't realise Jane was going to talk for quite so long. But if we don't get through it all, the slides are already up on LMS. I can look at what we don't get to today, next week. So where is planning thought influenced from today? So we did touch upon that slightly in week 4. So I want to build upon some of the arguments that were presented in week 4. We're going to recap on new urbanology, because in the sense that is the dominant planning thought, the dominant, dominant conversation within planning at the moment. And then what I want to end up talking about, so is there a space for better planning in a neoliberal world? I think you looked at this this article within last week's Toots. Did any of you look at it within your Toots? No? Oh, well, that's good. I'm going to basically have a look at what it means today to be a planner within this, I suppose, this world where we have moved into heightened neoliberalism. And we're going to look at what we call 2 parallel interventions. So hopefully some interventions which are moving away from the dominance of neoliberalism and are being led within planning, but not within the traditional structures of planning. So we're going to look at city networks, and we're going to look at urban resilience again. So where is planning thought influence from now? We've seen this before. So planning thought, of course, in recent decades has drifted quite some way from the wider geographical imagination. So we are starting to see stronger influences from the non-spatial and the non-scientific influences as well. So non-spatial, particularly economists, as we saw, I can't remember which week it was in, but economists don't generally consider the spatial aspect. They don't consider distribution. Economists consider efficiencies. And also some of the other non-social scientific influences as well. We're starting to see stronger influences from engineering as well as design and physics. Now, the problem, particularly from the disciplines of engineering and physics, well, it's not to suggest they don't have strong merit to be a part of the debate, but what those disciplines don't capture is the complexity that planning needs to consider. And we'll see that today. A lot of the debates put forward by engineering and physicists are very much linear. Planning, we need to think more about the complexities. I think Jane alluded to that as well. So when she was talking, this is probably not exactly what an engineer and a physicist would consider, but when we're talking about the conflict between where wind farms goes, so where we're thinking about where wind farms go, there's a conflict between, of course, encouraging and supporting renewable energy, but of course having a place for renewable energy, and I think she was talking about there the replacement around agricultural land. So how do we start to manage those trade-offs? So how do we balance sustainability? That's what's quite often written into legislations. So you can see our debates and what planners are trying to deal with are quite complex. So where have we moved to? So planning thought is very much influenced now from traditional economists. That is quite new. Traditional economists generally have not been as strong or dominant as part of planning thought until, I suppose, about the last 5 years. And that's where we've moved into the new urbanologists. So, I mean, it's not surprising that this has happened. We've got now, since the 1970s, we've been, there's a quote there from David Harvey, we have been very strong, the dominant ideology, values, has been neoliberalism. So it's not of surprise, it's disappointing that economists are now strongly influencing planning thought. So if we think about some of the dominance from neoliberalism, which has flowed into what we call neoliberal urbanism, this is some of the concepts and ideas you would have been exposed to last week. Neoliberals generally seek to deregulate markets, because remember they're looking at efficiencies. They don't want government intervention. If you have government intervention, well, economists understand if you have government interventions, that causes inefficiencies. So they want to let the free market rule. So typically neoliberals seek to deregulate markets. They want to advance free trade. Of course, they want to promote capital mobility, which of course is obstructed by regulation. They, of course, as you would have seen last week, advocate privatisation, because neoliberals strongly believe that assets will be better managed, be more efficiently managed by the private sector. Of course, that's disputable. Competitors, individualism and self-sufficiency is promoted. So you think about an economist, they're not spatial. So what they consider is the individual. They don't consider the collective. As planners, we generally, I hope we consider the collective. So you can start to see some of the dominance of neoliberalism and the neoliberal urbanism, but also some of the problems that we have for planners. So we think back to those 3 E's, which I think we spoke about, I don't know, week 1, 2, 3 or 4. And economists, they focus on efficiency. That's what the economic theories are about. It's about efficiency. So they're not useful for equity and the environment. So the focus of economists is on efficiencies. Economists as well, of course, are focusing on efficiencies, so they want to turn that optimal point. So what is the optimal point for production? It's not about considering what is the best outcome for society. It's what is most efficient, not what the social goal is. It's looking at the individual, it's not spatial, it's not looking at distribution, it's not looking at who gets what, it's just looking at the individual. And also the free market gives individuals the greatest incentive to act in ways which maximises their own wealth. Doesn't maximise it for the collective, doesn't look at who's getting what, doesn't have a look at if the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. It looks at the individual. So a bit of a recap and building on new urbanology. It's really important to be very aware of these texts because they are very influential within planning thought now. So we've looked at these texts before, but these are the 5 key texts of which are referred within the set of new urbanology. And as I've already talked about, the authors behind these texts are economists, they're from business schools, they're business consultants, so they're very much from the business management and economic disciplines. So they don't have they're not from geography, for example, of where planning thought has been heavily influenced from in the past. Now, I can't remember which week it was, but I talked about in the sense of where these debates have been disseminated, not only within Australia, but also within the Western discourse. They have gained quite high popularity with policymakers all around the world, particularly Trumpford of the City by Professor Edward Glaeser, who is an economist at Harvard. So this is the first time he's really moved into the city debates. So if you Google him and look at his list of publications, he hasn't before gone into this urban space. So this is quite new for these economists to be moving within this space. So we've already looked at, but I'll recap quickly, what are their ideas? So as a critical social scientist, we need to understand what are the ideas within these texts. And because particularly as these ideas are being espoused as what our urban futures should look like. So you can think about this just from a Melbourne perspective or your hometown, thinking, is that what you want your city to look like, is what is being espoused by these new urbanologists. So quite simply what they're talking about is they're looking at developing new economic landscapes. But as we'll see in a moment, these new economic landscapes is essentially just about driving more economic growth. They have a very overstated belief within technology. Of course, technology is important, but it's only part of the story. And also what they emphasise is the application or the further application of market mechanisms. So when we're talking about market mechanisms, we're talking about taxes, we're talking about quotas, price incentive, those sorts of things. So they're economic tools. So just to recap, in the sense within these texts, within these new urbanologists that are dominating the urban futures debates, so the contemporary debates, they're dominating. This is, I suppose, what you call a conceptual framework which sits within Bregman's book. So the theory situated within his book that really, which is central to his ideas, is neoclassical economics. And you can very, very quickly pick that up. So you can look, so he talks about efficiencies from economic and cost perspectives. And if you look at that slide quickly, there's nothing about equity, there's nothing about spatial aspects, nothing about distribution, there's nothing about the environment. That's quite a crude assessment, but you can quickly start to have a look at what is their emphasis. The emphasis is on the economics. Also, density is being considered from the perspective of driving further economic growth. So sometimes we talk about economic density from an environmental perspective. That debate is challenged, but here density is understood and applied to drive further economic growth. So density increases efficiency of the pursuit of economic opportunity. So the more density you have, the more markets. So the market is everywhere. So therefore, if the market is everywhere, volume increases, the opportunity for economies of scales. Then, of course, you have different association that happens with that, which encourages further collaboration. There's more people, there's more markets, there's more interaction. And then what Bregman is hoping is you have this model extended to other cities. So density is important it's more likely it is to achieve human innovation and economic efficiencies around productivity capacities and economies of scales. So you can start to see quite quickly economics is very much at the forefront here. But that's not surprising because these people are economists or business specialists. Florida as well, so he's one of the authors of the New Urbanologists. He talks about a reset, and here he's talking about a reset from the perspective of the global financial crisis or the GFC. So when capitalist institutions broke down. So he said in the first stage, as crisis set in, old institutions break, or the banks broke, the stock market broke, and businesses and consumers cut back their spending. But eventually what he's saying, what will happen is, the second stage will involve new innovations. So here he's very much drawing upon the ideas around entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurship drives new innovations, which of course the beginning of new markets. And so then what happens is we have new technologies are forged together by the entrepreneurials into bigger and better technology systems. So you can see the emphasis on the economics, entrepreneurship and technologies. Then we move into the fourth stage, which is around new public and private investments into energy, transportation and communication, which of course will provide this broad skeleton to support this new economic landscape, which is meant to also increase the speed and velocity of city life. So what he's advocating for here is a new model, or supposedly a new economic landscape. But you probably need to argue whether it is actually new as well. So what's new within this? The sense is about continuing, and it's about progressing what we've already got, taking it to a new level. So this is what we call heightened neoliberalism. This is as well, we've seen this as well, but this is this overstated belief in technology. So having the airport as the city, so having the airport as a centre is around overstated belief in technology, but it's also this emphasis on the economics. So this emphasis on the economics is around, of course, having at the heart of the city around capital mobility. So if you increase efficiencies around capital mobility, you should be able to drive economic landscape, drive economic growth, and here you're creating new economic landscapes. So therefore you're supporting heightened neoliberalism. So what are some of the other key initiatives and key ideas centred within the New Urbanologies text? So the emphasis on ecological modernisation. So ecological modernisation is generally ideas or initiatives that have been put forward which have a win, they say a win for the environment and a win for the economy. So energy efficiency fits well there. Or fuel efficient cars, in a sense you've got good new technology which is going to be more environmentally clean, for example. Now, of course, there's absolutely nothing wrong with these technologies. These technologies are absolutely fantastic. But we've got to think about whether these ideas are an adequate or even appropriate response now for our critical environmental social issues. So, of course, fuel efficient cars and energy efficiency homes are absolutely part of our urban futures, but you need to argue whether these ideas go far enough. So Gleeson, in 2013, critiqued the New Urbanologists, and what he questioned was, to what extent do the new popular urbanists acknowledge and draw upon the tradition of social scientists, social scientific scholarship that has investigated and debated the human experience of urbanisation for quite some time. So within these New Urbanologies texts, do they reference, for example, Gleeson's work, a very well established international urban theorist based here at the University of Melbourne? So go to the reference list and have a look. Who are they citing? What work are they drawing upon? So to what extent and in what ways will the neuroentrists be willing to adopt and deploy the methods and expectations of urban social sciences? So if we look at the New Urbanology and we look at these New Urbanology textbooks, I would challenge you to see if you can find of any of these texts cite any key critical social scientists with any of these books. So do they consider these tried and tested critiques that have been around for quite some time, which are present supposedly as new ideas within these New Urbanologies textbooks? So what critical social sciences are arguing, who are critiquing these new, or supposedly these new ideas, and have, as you can see by some of the dates of the citations there, have been critiquing these for quite some time. So the relationship between density, housing density and energy use is not linear. It's impacted by many other variables, and the key one is affluence. See if you can find that that debate incorporated within these New Urbanologies textbooks. Of course, the overstated solution of the Erythropolis model, just from a perspective of security, is never going to go all that far. And the environmental outcomes, in the sense of considering the complexities around different relationships. I always draw upon, which I think I've already said to this class as well, telecommuting. So telecommuting was thought originally when the idea was sort of first evolving, was going to involve a reduction of mileage to work. But it's actually resulted with an increase in mileage to work, because what we've done is by telecommuting is given people a greater proximity around where they live. So for example, if I really only need to be at work 1 day a week, I've worked 5 days, but I only need to be present at work 1 day a week, I may decide to live, I don't know, Anglesey, for example. But if I need to be at work 5 days a week, I might live at North Melbourne. So North Melbourne to here, I don't know how far is it, there and back, so 2 k's. Anglesey, I don't know how far it is. 100 k's there and back. So you can start to see 200 k's versus 10 k's. So it's the unintended consequences, but also it's around considering the complexities of relationships, of which, if you go and look at these New Urbanologies texts, they don't really get into the complexities. So what we need to have a look at is, do these solutions proposed by new urbanologists provide an adequate or appropriate response to our critical environmental issues? So are these ideas going to enable an urban future which does consider what does have good environmental and social outcomes? So as critical social scientists, we need to argue that these new and influential urban schemes and visions, of course, fail to comprehensively engage with the imperatives of critical social sciences. So they don't include debates about social equity, failing human ecology and urban citizenship. So this is a real problem. So we've got these contemporary debates, and in the contemporary debates, new urbanology is very much at the fore, but it doesn't consider debates around social equity, human ecology and urban citizenship. So we've got some real problems. So where are we at? So of course we've got the dominance of new urbanology, and it's of course the dominance will marginalise other debates around equity and the environment. And of course we've got no consideration of the critiques well established already in critical social science within the text of urbanology. So where we are at is described quite well by Kaika and Swinnerto, which are academics from the University of Manchester. They call this a political deadlock. So what does a political deadlock mean? A political deadlock is around, at this point, policymakers and strategists and civil society organisations are all paying increased attention to the extraordinary wealth of urban socio-ecological research becoming available. So we've got massive amounts of urban socio-ecological research, more than any other point in time. And also we've got more increased attention is being paid to urban environmental problems. But even with these two things happening, we're still within this deadlock. So I suppose what this shows is the strength of heightened neoliberalism. So how do we break this deadlock? So we need to break this deadlock, because if we don't break the deadlock, we think about those 3 E's and 2 of them are missing. So equity and the environment are missing. So what Swinnerto talks about, I'm not quite sure about his words here. Of course, he talks about politicalising the environment. And when he's talking about politicising the environment, what he's talking about there is talk about the conflict and tensions. So talk about Federation Square and talk about the conflicts and tensions there. Should it be economically viable, or how can we make it as a public space be more viable? So there is conflicts and tensions there. There's different scenarios of what the way forward could be. Also, so another really good example is sustainability. So when we're talking about sustainability, so I own a car, I drive the car as much as I want to, but we're talking about a sustainable city. Should I be able to drive a car as much as I want to? And there's a conflict and a tension there, but we don't really talk about these conflicts and tensions. So what he talks about here is he talks about the violence of sustainable cities. I'm not sure about the word violence, maybe I just don't like it. But what he's talking about is he wants a space to be able to debate these conflicts and tensions. And as I said, what the example that he draws upon here is that we cannot have a truly carbon neutral city and permit unlimited car-based mobility. Essentially that's what we've got. They of course are mutually exclusive. So what we need to do is, as I've already said, we need to unpack these conflicts and tensions, and hopefully to be able to rearrange what he calls the socio-ecological coordinates of everyday life. So unfortunately, new urbanology provides a very good example of what we call mainstreaming neoliberal sustainability into sustainable futures. So what new urbanologists have done, they haven't debated the conflicts and tensions. They haven't debated the conflicts or tensions of developing new economic landscapes which are furthering economic growth and the consequences of that around equity or human ecology, they have not been debated. But they position themselves, these books advocate and position themselves around urban futures. So what they have done here, and they've actually done it, unfortunately, they've actually done it very well. They have normalised neoliberal sustainability into sustainable futures. Kaika builds upon what Sundardo was saying around the politicisation of the environment. Of course, now it's 2018, sure, it's in 2017, but the Brundtland Report has been around for how many years? 30, is it? 25, 30? We all know what the Brundtland Report is, yeah? So the Brundtland Report, of course, coined the very popular definition of sustainability. So 30 years on, unfortunately, we now have sufficient documentation that the policy and institutional technological experiment that followed the excitement and optimism of the 1987 Brundtland Report did not deliver sustainable development that the report conceptualised. Of course, the report conceptualised sustainability not around normalising neoliberal sustainability. The report conceptualised sustainable development around the 3 E's: equity, the environment, and of course the economy as well. So it had all three of them. So I mean, this is of course incredibly disappointing and really raised significant concerns around what our urban futures will look like. So Sundardo further adds, of course the economy is greening, sustainable policies and practices are now part of the standard toolkit of any public or private actor. Carbon is traded, trees are planted, actors act, energy efficiency increases, and technologies are retrofitted. But of course we all know greenhouse gases keep on rising. So greening the economy does not seem to deflect the process of disastrous social environmental transformation. So of course the implications here of the impacts of climate change is what he's referring to. So what we need to get to is some form of realisation around sustainability actually requires a deep transformation of the structures underlying what is currently termed as human progress. So we need to really consider, if we're going to continue to use the term sustainability, we really need to consider it requires some form of understanding within human progress. We've got to think of it from more of a transformative perspective rather than just normalising it within economic discourse. So it's very important, therefore, to critically appraise and challenge these new urban assertions, which are coming out of new urbanologists, that threaten to commit us to a disastrous, failing path of neoliberalism. Okay, so you're probably at this point wondering what hope there is. Don't worry, it's not all doom and gloom. So I'll leave those aspects for you to go back and look at that. I can't underestimate, though, in the sense of as we are moving forward and as you go into policy development jobs, to have a good understanding around economics. Because as you can see from new urbanologists, economics is really strong in the debates within urban studies. So it is good to be able to understand what models and theories economists are putting forward, but more importantly, it's really important to understand the debates and the critiques of those different ideas that have been put forward by the economists. So is there a space for better planning in a neoliberal world? So we saw within the Indigenous Planning lecture by Libby Porter, is that spaces are starting to be developed of where we can talk about this conflict and tension. And there she referred to as the treaty as that space. So I'm going to talk about two other spaces which are emerging, which hopefully we can see better planning. So hopefully within that treaty we'll start to see better planning for everybody. And we're also seeing cities are creating new spaces as well of where the socio-ecological imperatives of climate resilience are getting a greater space of debate as well. So we're going to just quickly look at new global city governance. And next week we're going to have a lecture in the first part by Professor Michaela Akuto, who is a new professor who's just been appointed here at the University of Melbourne. And his work very much has focused on the rise of these city networks. And these city networks, essentially what city networks are cities working together. So you're not, in a sense, cities are bypassing national governments. So what we're seeing, Melbourne, for example, working with London and New York, rather than working directly within national government policy. Of course, Melbourne still will be working with national government policy, but what is becoming stronger is that cities are working more closely together to collaborate and share ideas around climate and resilience. So why are they doing this? Well, of no surprises, it's essentially national governments have been quite apathetic on policies around climate change. So Australia, of course, is a very good example of that. But the problem is cities are in the front line in the sense the impacts of climate change are being felt by the cities, and cities need to respond. So you think of natural disasters, for example, and you think of some of the big natural disasters which have happened and have impacted cities. So most cities are by, of course, by oceans or rivers, so going to feel the full force of climate change. So cities need to act, so they are acting, and they are bypassing national governments in doing so. So we're seeing two key city networks which have evolved to address these socio-ecological imperatives. And one of them is around climate, which is the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, and the other one is around resilience, and that's the 100 Resilient Cities. Now this is very new. These city networks, while city networks have been around for quite some time, the positioning and the power that these city networks are now having is quite new. So what we're seeing is quite new, innovative policy-making platforms which have been driven by a new generation of city networks. And these city networks actually sit outside of traditional planning processes. So, for example, they're not situated within Plan Melbourne. So that slide that Jane put up around Plan Melbourne doesn't have an emphasis at all on city networks. So Plan Melbourne is within the traditional planning processes. But C40 and 100 Resilient Cities, which is Resilient Melbourne, sit outside of these traditional planning processes. Also, they've been funded as well by non-traditional sources. So they're not being funded by national governments or state governments. They've been funded by organisations like Rockefeller and Bloomberg. And Bloomberg is putting a lot of money, for example, into the C40 Climate Network, which makes them quite powerful as well, because they've got a high level of economic resources. So these city networks are growing. So what we're seeing is that every year since around 2014, about 4 new city networks are evolving every year around some different issue. We'll have a look at the different issues in a moment. And also what we're seeing is city networks are collaborating together as well. So for example, C40 is collaborating with the WHO Healthy Cities. So they're sort of gaining force by working together on cross-sectoral issues. So 30% of city networks are now working together across issues. So what you start to see is that we're starting to see early signs of a development, I suppose, of a strategic platform around city networks. So they gain greater strength, of course, by working together on particular issues. Melbourne is a really good example of that, and I'll talk to that in a moment. So as I said, city networks have been around for quite some time, but we're moving into what we call the second phase, and that started around the 2000s. And what we're starting to see with these city networks is they're becoming more strategic. So they are, in a sense, having more visible political stance as well. So a really good example of that is within the development goals. Cities, for the first time, is explicitly mentioned in the Sustainable Development Goals, and that was because of an emphasis from Bloomberg. So you can see the political stance within the UN from these city networks has increased. And also, as I said, they've got non-traditional policy partners, so Rockefeller and Bloomberg, and we're seeing this stronger blending of the public and private, and that leads to governance. So we've got public and private working together around some form of decision-making platform, that's governance. And C40 has had, I suppose, particular prominence within this next generation of city networks. He incorporates the most economically powerful global cities in the world. So there's two socio-ecological imperatives. The first one, as I said, is around climate. So we now have this term called urban climate governance. And that is particularly been representative from these city networks with the blending of the public and private. Now the C40, it's not all good news. The C40 is very representative of this new transnational urban governance. And it was formed in 2005, but here it has an exclusive membership. So you can only be part of this city network if you have a certain level of GDP and population. So that's okay for Melbourne, it's okay for Sydney from an Australian context, but it's not okay for Perth, Adelaide, Hobart. I've missed one city out. So it's exclusive. So in a sense, it's not around the collective. It's very much here. It's an exclusive network. So that does raise certain issues. But the C40 is growing in traction. From the perspective they count their climate actions, they are increasing. And what we're starting to see as well is around 30% of climate actions are now being delivered through city-to-city collaborations. So it shows the power around the value of collaboration and information sharing with city networks. So we're really seeing that model of cities working with cities as quite effective to be able to deliver on climate actions. Governing for urban resilience as well, that's been very much driven by the 100 Resilient Cities. It's been funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. Who's heard of Resilient Melbourne here? Couple? Yep. Okay, Resilient Melbourne is a really interesting organisation. I'll skip to where it is. So what Resilient Melbourne did, so Australia, for those of you who are not from Australia, we don't have metropolitan governance. So when we're thinking about the growth that's happening within these city networks, it's really difficult for Australian cities to participate within these networks because we don't have a metropolitan governance. So how does Melbourne, for example, as a whole city, participate within these networks? Very difficult because we've got state government and we've got local government. So what Resilient Melbourne did was they developed a collective, I suppose a collective new metropolitan collaborative governance in absence of metropolitan governance. But that includes the 32 local governments. And then they released a collective resilience strategy. So from an Australian governance perspective, that's very progressive. Now it's governance, not government, because Resilient Melbourne is funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. It's not funded by the state government, it's not funded, there is input from local governments. So what we've seen here is the development of a new collaborative governance platform which is around governing for resilience for Melbourne. But at the same time, Melbourne has two key strategies around the urban future. So within traditional planning, of course, we've got Plan Melbourne Refresh, which is our metropolitan strategy. But also now we've got this Resilient Melbourne, resilient strategy, which is sitting parallel. So how do they integrate? What's their crossover? Or is there a crossover? So what we're starting to see is this intervention. So Resilient Melbourne strategy is quite progressive. It's quite progressive from a socio-ecological perspective. So we've got this quite progressive strategy, but then we've got Plan Melbourne Refresh, which is sitting within traditional planning. So if you look at Plan Melbourne Refresh, it references resilience, cross-references resilience once. So whether we're seeing cross-fertilisation of the strategies yet, or if it's going to be possible, we don't know. But what we're seeing, though, is some form of intervention that's sitting outside of traditional planning processes. And of course, this is happening all around the world. Because 100 resilient cities, Rockefeller Foundation has funded 100 cities to produce these resilient strategies. So these resilient strategies, as I've said, sit outside of normal traditional funding models. So we are seeing some intervention, hopefully, into having a greater emphasis, hopefully, on socio-ecological aspects. But it's too early to tell. So Resilient Melbourne was released, I think, in about the end of 2016. So it's too early to see what possible intervention or change may start to evolve within our traditional planning structures, and that's our metropolitan planning schemes. As you can see here, within Melbourne, Melbourne is one of the top most networked global cities. So all this slide is meant to do, this list, to show you, is that there are a lot of city networks present within our cities. And these hopefully hold some form of hope to increase the presence or provide places where we can start to have a stronger debate around the socio-ecological aspects. But the key is we have to have some form of intervention into the traditional planning processes. But you would hope with the sheer force of the numbers which are increasing that might possibly be possible. For those of you who are interested in this particular area, I've given you some research questions. So kidding. So questions here to focus on in the sense of this is really a new area. In the sense these interventions for city networks, and there's a lot of unknown that could possibly come out of the intervention that city networks are providing. So a bit of a conclusion around city networks, and of course I don't have time to go on with resilience. But city networks are providing some form of space outside of traditional planning processes of where we can have a stronger debate around climate resilience, but a stronger emphasis on the socio and ecological. Now we need these spaces, we need these interventions to break what we call that political ecological deadlock. So hopefully within some of these innovations which are happening, so Resilient Melbourne has developed that collaborative governance platform, very innovative. Hopefully what that can start to do is to I suppose, prioritise some of the socio-ecological aspects around planning, or in this case, planning for Melbourne. So next week what we'll look at is we'll recap on resilience as well, and how we're starting to see conceptually for resilience within urban resilience, a movement away from just engineering resilience to socio-ecological resilience. And that's quite new, I suppose, situated within the contemporary debate. And also we've got the lecture as well from Professor Akuto. And for those of you who are starting to do studios or minor thesis, I really suggest that you come along because he's got some really great new ideas as well within that. Okay, are there any questions? Yeah, great.
So basically sustainability has just become economic reductionism.
Yes.
So when's resilience going to go the same way?
Well, that's what I was hoping to talk about today, the second part, so I'll talk about that next week. Well, I think we've got to have some hope that it won't. I think the political project of sustainability, I think I've drawn upon those quotes. I think sustainability hasn't worked. But I actually, and I used to be quite a pessimist, I actually hold some hope for resilience. And I really strongly encourage you to look at some of these resilience strategies which are coming out of 100 resilience cities, because the emphasis is different. And we haven't actually seen such a strong emphasis within development of city planning like we have with these. So I'm going to be optimistic at this stage. Look, I could be proven wrong, you're right, and maybe, but what that points to, though, is the political ecological deadlock is too strong. And that's really concerning. What does that mean for our urban futures? I don't know, I find that concerning for all generations, but that's what it will say. If we can't progress with resilience from a progressive point of view, so